Welcome to episode number 5 of the Discipleship Directives with Dr. Dan Crawford. I'm your host, Vidal Muñiz, and I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us this morning. Dr. Crawford, how are you today, sir?
I'm great. Beautiful day in the neighborhood.
Well, the seasons are changing and we're enjoying definitely our time together. And this morning, we're continuing the conversation over what took place last month. And I'm saying last month, we're in the middle of November. Our podcast is going to be downloaded a little later during the week, but it's still, we're coming from last month as you came down to South Texas and you've been on this journey of speaking to our pastors on the issue of discipleship. And specifically this last month, you made a reference on the issue of fasting as one of the ingredients of prayer. So could you help us this morning just to give us a little bit of expanding further on this subject?
Sure. Most of the time when fasting is mentioned in the Bible, it's mentioned along with prayer. You get the phrase prayer and fasting many, many times, especially in the New Testament. By definition, fasting is any deliberate self-denial for the purpose of growing spiritually stronger. So you have multiple kinds of fastings, and they're called by various names depending on who you might be reading, but a normal fast would be eliminating everything except water. And then what is called an absolute fast would be eliminating the water as well. So that would be a maximum of 3 days. You're not supposed to be able to live beyond 3 days. In any case, a person that starts out on a fast probably needs to check with their doctor, especially if they're on some kind of prescription medications. Partial fast would be a diet restriction of some kind, like Daniel, for instance, went on a partial fast of eliminating choice foods. So we have that kind. And then there's the 40-day fast, which is a supernatural. Moses did it, Elijah did it, but I wouldn't recommend it unless you have a doctor monitoring you and you know exactly what you're doing. It's not the kind of fast that just anybody would go on. So there are long ones and there are short ones, and in fact, breakfast really means breaking the all-night fast. So you eat breakfast in the morning. So that's a pretty short fast, and anybody can be on that one because you sleep through it mostly. So that's a little bit of a definition of what fasting is.
We're such a doing hands-on generation that you are at the beginning. You mentioned the denial of self as one of the goals or the objectives. And the denial of self, are we also implying that this denying of self is for the purpose to focus on the character of God? Because again, important as it is for us to deny ourselves and to obviously move into obedience, we got to be reminded of the object of our obedience, the reason why we obey. So let me just ask you this, because you mentioned a couple of biblical names. Can you be more specific, maybe on some biblical examples of people who actually, went into this experience, and how is it that the character of God was glorified through their fasting?
Yeah, actually, in the Old Testament, there are 44 different persons who are said to have fasted. And you would be able to guess who some of those were, Moses and Joshua and David and Daniel and Ezekiel. And then you get the New Testament, there are 31 different people described as having fasted, obviously Jesus and Paul and the church leaders in Antioch and Anna before the birth of Christ. And so you have a lot of different biblical characters. You go beyond the Bible, it reads like a list of characters out of church history. You've got Martin Luther and John Calvin, and you got Wesley and Moody and Graham. And it's obviously something that's a part of the discipline of prayer for many, many people, biblical and otherwise.
So you see the fasting component.
The purpose is to glorify God.
Yeah. You see the fasting component as something that goes hand in hand with prayer. Is that what we're looking at right now?
Yes, it doesn't have to, but it's just the fact that many times in the Bible, prayer and fasting are listed together. So when I'm talking about prayer, I usually include fasting as one of the ingredients, possible ingredients of prayer.
And we've been on this subject for a while, speaking on prayer and discipleship, and I'm processing your teaching through your monthly visits and now our time together through the podcast, where typically our tendency is to agree on prayer, or in this case fasting, but I get the impression that sometimes our agreement has some sort of a catch, where people are willing to pray, might be willing to fast, as long as, and then here's a catch, where God will give me X, Y, and Z. And so, because this is a developmental experience called discipleship, let me ask you this question: is there any possibility that we might abuse fasting?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, you hear people talk about fasting in order to lose weight. Well, you may lose weight when you fast, but that's not the purpose of spiritual fasting. That would be a byproduct, so to speak, a secondary effect. So you don't fast spiritually in order to lose weight. And there are ways to abuse it. I was in a meeting a few years ago where one of the guys in the meeting announced that he was going on a 40-day fast. And he had talked with his doctors, and it was going to be a liquid fast. So we all encouraged him and wondered if it was going to work. And a few months later, that group met again, and he had fasted, and it appeared to us that he had gained weight. So finally, somebody asked him how his fast went, and here's what he did. He bought a blender, and everything he wanted to eat, he just put in the blender and turned it into liquid. So he went on a liquid fast. It's like, you want a coconut pie, put it in the blender and drink it. You want a steak, blend it and drink it. And so I think I would have said that's an abuse of biblical fasting, and especially a 40-day fast. He didn't fast. He just turned everything into liquids and drank it. But it seemed that he gained a little weight along the way.
And again, I'm thinking that if we're not careful, we approach this discipleship conversation through the lenses of formulas.
Mm-hmm.
Just simply give me a quick step into, and especially, and again, I'm not minimizing when people are going through difficulties and trials, and they are honest on seeking the Lord, but yet at the same time, it's that developmental understanding of Christ likeness, whether it's through the mind or eventually through our behavior. And let me again, because we don't want to make sure that we don't neither abuse nor have a misconception, but is there a possibility that we can fast on something else besides food?
Absolutely. As I mentioned, Daniel 10:3 talks about him fasting from choice foods. So yes, and yes, even more. Yes, you can fast from just eating by limiting your diet. And if you have prescription medications and physical issues, that might be a better way to go than just eliminating all solids. Some scholars think that Daniel fasted from a kind of eye salve that was popular in that day. So that's certainly a non-food item. But again, be careful. It's not something that you ought to go into without being aware of your physical condition. It's certainly not a long fast without that. But I hear a lot of people these days on social media. I see them post, I'm going to be off for the next week or the next 2 weeks. I'm going to fast from Facebook or whatever social media they might be on. And that is a way of fasting. Again, it's self-denial, deliberate self-denial for the purpose of growing spiritually stronger. And if fasting from television or fasting from the use of the internet or anything like that. If that's for the purpose of growing spiritually stronger, then it should have the same effect as fasting from food. So by all means, even though most of the fasting is related to food, it doesn't have to be.
We live in a time and age, Dr. Crawford, where we are so rapidly distracted, and it has become a way of life, instant access to information, instant access to one another. Back in the day, you remember the days where for people to get a hold of you, they have to call a specific phone number and then see if anybody answers. And then answer machines came into place. And then the development of communication obviously grew and has exploded, which is like everything else. There has a pros and cons. And yet we're speaking of, again, processes and steps into a discipleship component. So it seems to me that whether it's fasting or prayer, we have to be reminded that at the end of the conversation is the developmental, the understanding of walking in Christ likeness, where the win comes into that, again, this process of growing into the image of Jesus. Now, time is flying and is moving fast and furious, as you know, and we're coming to the end of the year of 2022. And it's been a very good year for many of us, with a lot of challenges as well. And part of that is having you down in South Texas. It's been a blessing to have you month after month. You've been so committed and so faithful, for which we are very, very grateful. So once again, we're coming to the end of November, and precisely at the end of November, which is going to be the last Tuesday of November, the 29th, you're coming back for our pastors' gathering at First Baptist Church in Rio Hondo. So help us a little bit on what's coming up. It's going to be in the next 2 weeks. What are we talking about on November the 29th?
Well, we reached the point of talking about the kinds of answers that God might give to a prayer request. And we'll be talking about some of the obvious answers, the yes and no answers, and sometimes the wait answer. But specifically in this next session in the Lower Valley, we'll be talking about the yes answer. So sometimes God says yes. And we saw that in a group with the International Mission Board. We were doing a prayer journey around the world, and we were in India. And one of the members, we had actually left the hotel in Calcutta. We were at the train station waiting for an overnight train to the Kand Hills. And one of the members of our group said, "I don't have my passport with me. I think I've lost my passport." Well, India is not a good place to lose your passport. In fact, there was a visa stamped in it that got us into our next country. So he was going to be stuck in India. The train was coming. We didn't have time to go anywhere. So we said, well, we're going to get on the train and we're going to pray. And we're going to ask God to get the passport back with the guy that lost it. And that's what we did. Unbeknownst to us, the cab driver found the passport, took it back to the hotel where he'd picked us up, gave it to the hotel desk clerk. Now we're talking about two people who could have made a lot of money in the black market selling a U.S. passport. Neither one did. They did what they should have done. The manager of the hotel then the next morning knew another American staying in the hotel, and I guess he figured all Americans know each other. So he called him and said, "Do you know this man?" And it turned out it was a missionary, and he did know the guy in our group. Our guy had flown, when we arrived the next morning, he'd flown to Delhi to go to the U.S. Embassy and try to get it corrected. When he got off the plane, here was this other guy from the hotel holding his passport and handed it to him. So it was a definite yes answer to prayer. They don't always turn out like that, but sometimes God just says yes. And we're going to be looking at some of those answers that God gives to prayer, and especially the yes answer.
Well, I can only imagine, traveling overseas, and I've never been in that situation, but I can only imagine. That's a very unique situation when you're in a different country, and yet here is God's intervention, giving the yes to the experience, to having this happy ending. But again, it's not always the case, right? It's not always the case.
Not always.
And we go back into the understanding that we are speaking of the shape, prayer disciple, understanding, the being shaped into the likeness of Jesus Christ, and in this case, using the vehicle of prayer. So we're looking forward to have you. We're looking forward to fellowship with you. Again, this is the end of November, and we want to thank everybody for joining the conversation today. Would you remind us of the website where people can come and look at your resources, the books that you've written, and your itinerary and conferences? Tell us the name of your website.
Yes, it's just Disciple All Nations, as if that were one word, discipleallnations.org.
Wonderful. Well, folks, we love for you guys to subscribe. We'd like for you guys to like wherever you're listening, watching this broadcast. Love to have you back and continue the conversation over the issue of discipleship. And we love to have you guys. Thank you again. Dr. Crawford, have a wonderful day, and we'll see you guys next time. God bless.